Hi, Rosa. My question is I haven't followed this literature very closely, and I will state my bias outright, which is because of a large sense of skepticism in terms of the abilities of these deep neural networks to provide explanatory power that it would be useful for a neuroscientist like myself. But one question that I was going to ask, which is something that I also have been shifting in the past few years, is given the success of these models, like you point out, it really tells us that we should stop there and should we consider them more carefully. But the question that I wanted to have about clarification is the following: Are there benchmarks on tests and studies that have looked at some aspects of visual cortical responses and how well they are matched with the deep neural network counterparts that take any task-related factors, attentional state, or other types of, because the fits probably are very impressive, and you showed some pretty striking examples. But I'm wondering, just for first clarification, and maybe we can discuss this more broadly, the extent to which they have been evaluated with other more, I wouldn't say naturalistic, but more like task-like that have some behavioral relevance to the monkey, and not just something that is closer to passive viewing, or if you will. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that, and then we can discuss more broadly later.
Yeah, I think it is important to have things that are closer to task, and all the stuff that I've shown is just passive viewing. I guess I'm not sure how you would make comparisons for things like done while attending, done while distracted, between biological systems and artificial systems, since they don't have those corresponding states, or at least not obviously. Yeah, I think there are some studies that have the animals doing actual tasks instead of just passively viewing, like choosing something from the same category, but I actually don't know the details, but I could get back to you. I don't know if that was really a clarificatory question, actually.
Well, we can come back on the question later. I urge you, please do this short session for clarificatory questions. We'll have a longer questions later. Charles, please.
Yeah, hi, Rosa, cool talk. At the beginning, you listed a few questions you wanted to address. The third one was, why are deep neural network models predictive of brain data? And then I don't know if I could isolate your answer to that question in the talk. So could you just give a 1 or 2 sentence answer to why you think deep neural networks are predictive of brain data?
Yeah, so that was just the last part. So the thought is, if the visual categorization task is so hard that there's only one kind of solution to it, then the thought is the artificial network and the biological one found the same answer to it, ended up with a similar answer, and that's why one is predictive of the other.
Got it.
Because they were forced to be similar.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Could you perhaps, in a nutshell, say what your response to the unintelligibility objection was? So even if I accept that brains work similar as neural networks do, is it not the case that I don't understand both? What was exactly your response to that?
So I guess there are 2 parts to it. So one is, I say we understand a little bit why or how the neural network works at a low level, right? Like you understand what each piece is doing. But that somehow still feels unintelligible because you can't hold it all in your head, right? There's like too many pieces and too many parameters. and you can't sort of like run an internal model of your external model in your head. So that's why it kind of feels like you're not really understanding anything by having this model. I think I want to say something like, nonetheless, you can understand a little bit better why it works if you see that that the landscape of the problem that you're trying to solve is shaped in a certain way that makes having these parameters, having this arrangement necessary in some ways. So I think we want, like, it's a nice feature of explanations when they show that some outcome is necessary or highly likely rather than unlikely. But I think to get to your actual, maybe a better way of getting to your question is something like, I think intelligibility is in some ways a summary of the cognitive cost to us of using a model to predict what's going on and to predict what interventions would do. And the critics are certainly right that the cost of using a neural network model to predict what's going to happen next is quite high. In particular, you can't sort of eyeball it and guess what the outcome is going to be. You sort of have to run the model. Right. So in that sense, you don't have some like closed form analytic solution that will let you jump to the end and just like know what the answer is. So in that way, they're not as intelligible as you would like. On the other hand, you have some idea of how changes that you make early on might have effects later on. So to that extent, they're not totally black boxes. So I think they sit somewhere in the middle. They're like, not as transparent and intelligible and easily graspable as you would like, but they're also not, maximally high cost to use the way just having another monkey and having to go poke around in its brain would be very high cost for you to use as a way of understanding a first monkey. I can't hear you.
Marco, you got a problem with the microphone?
How can you hear me?
Well, a bit better, but not so much. So maybe we can just ask the first discuss, and we can go in alphabetic order. So maybe Cameron is the first. Cameron?
Yes.
Okay.
You see and
Can you
hear me?
just... Yeah, perfectly. Okay.
Okay. So I wanted to say first, I'm just delighted that Professor CAO is working on this, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate. For the last few years, I've been trying to convince everybody that'll listen that despite the trendiness and practical utility of deep learning, there's actually something really philosophically interesting going on here. Pushing back on Professor CAO's line is a little bit hard for me because I agree with her on almost everything. But this gives me an opportunity maybe to throw some of the hardest questions that I've received back at her and see if she can give me some better answers. So I'll try that. My first question maybe overlaps a little bit with the one that Luis was asking first in the clarificatory bits, but maybe I'll provide a little bit more context. So one of the objections that Professor CAO considers is the worry that, don't we have these technical universal approximation results that show that deep nets are powerful enough to fit any arbitrary curve? Why should we be impressed with the degree of similarity to biological performance here? And you say, well, there are these ethological constraints, for example, that we've imposed on their performance. And so it sort of shouldn't be a surprise or a miracle if they end up with some strong functional similarities to the way that animals solve these problems. But then you can push back a little bit. So the critics also say, but really, is the way that we currently train and test the deep convolutional neural networks that ethologically realistic? So you could complain about static images versus more dynamic interaction. You could worry about the way that the convolutional filters are just kind of systematically tiled over the whole input, rather than kind of saccading around and constraining limited attention the way you explore the scene. And also people have emphasized sort of dynamic interaction with the objects. If you look at the way a baby learns, the baby can, grip and taste and interact with stimuli in a lot of different ways that the neural networks just can't. And so I guess the question is the way that you've emphasized the ethological relevance here. Do you think that more ethological similarity is automatically a good thing. So for example, like LeCun thinks that we should be trying to train the deep nets in the future more on video, successive video frames rather than just static images, and that's, you know, pretty much automatically going to be a good thing. Or do you think it's an empirical question whether making the training of these nets even more biologically realistic would automatically be a good thing? And if it is an empirical question, like, what does it turn on?
Okay, great. Yeah, so I totally agree. The training regimen is not ethologically plausible at all. But I think, as you said, lots of people, including the Yemen's group, are working on more ethologically plausible training regimens in various ways. I think I would say something like, your task fixes what your target of explanation is, right? So insofar as we are interested in explaining just this narrow part of our capacity, which is we can in fact look at pictures and label them with the dominant object in them, this is an explanation of that capacity. Maybe it's not an explanation of the rest of our visual capacities. On the other hand, like, there's some degree of evidence that, like, being able to do this thing requires you to have a lot of the features that allow you to do the other things that we think are more interesting, like dealing with moving images that are changing on the basis of how you move yourself and so on. I think in response to the last thing you said, I do think it's an empirical question how important it is that the training regimens are similar in the biological and the artificial cases. And actually, I was just reading this article by Milton Friedman about how economists were often complaining about the unrealistic assumptions that go into their models. It's like internal debate among economists, and it seemed like a presumption there was like false assumptions or like unrealistic assumptions definitely make your model bad. And I think I agree with what Friedman says, which is something like, well, heuristically, it's reasonable to think that reasonable assumptions lead to better models, right? Plausible assumptions lead to better models, but actually the proof just is in the pudding, right? Actually, like, what lets you decide whether the assumptions you had going in were too unrealistic or whether they were unrealistic, but their unrealisticness doesn't matter, is just how good your model ends up being at predicting the things that you wanted it to predict in the first place. And so I think in this case, the fact that you have reasonably good model fits to neural data is a kind of validation of the assumptions that went in, to the extent that you do have good predictions. And you don't have really great predictions in all cases. So you have really good predictions just of category things, but you don't have the same pattern of errors in specific cases within categories as primates show or that humans show. So like humans and monkeys show more similar patterns of errors than either of them do with machines. So I think like that's a place where you can say, oh, well, one reason that the error profiles are different is probably just because, they're not doing the exact same task. They weren't optimized to do the same task in the same way.
Okay, yeah, great, thanks. So the next worry I had a few years ago, so I guess the big worry is that trying to figure out where this view fits in the kind of space of approaches to explanation in philosophy of mind or philosophy of neuroscience, right? So there used to be this picture that you had kind of like the identity theory physicalists over here, and you had the functionalists over here, and they thought about things like multiple realization. And then mechanism came along. It was supposed to be this kind of nice, groovy new middle ground where different levels of explanation could constrain each other, but there wasn't a primacy either for the functional level or for the physical level, right? And that shook things up. But I wrote a paper a few years ago responding to some of Dan Weisskopf's arguments that contemporary neural network stuff, for example, is a functionalist approach to explanation. He tries to kind of update some of the old Fedorian lines. And I don't know if I got kind of like permanently traumatized by trying to respond to Dan, but I feel like I have a Dan Weisskopf module in my head. And while I was reading the paper, the Dan Weisskopf module was very active And so again, this is not my view, but trying to reprise some of the harder questions I can imagine Dan asking. I guess one of the worries is you rely a lot on this method of transform similarity when you're amending the 3M criterion, right? And so I guess one way to put the concern is that the transform similarity method of mapping, and that's fundamentally, I guess, what's doing the mapping between the neural networks and the bits of brain for you, is this linear transform similarity, or whatever other method of transform similarity mapping you're going to be using, is fundamentally functional, right? So it's really unconstrained pretty highly in terms of structure or even internal organization. It's an entirely functional criterion. So my Dan Weisskopf module here is saying, aha, right? That's what makes this 3M++ method become a purely functional approach to explanation as opposed to a mechanistic one. And just I don't know if this is like kind of turning the dagger too, but like I was struck this morning. I noticed that like the classic Block and Fodor 72 article about functionalist approach to explanations in philosophy of mind that Dan also draws on a lot. It uses three lines of evidence to argue that in philosophy of mind we should be functionalists. It uses the Lashley doctrine of neurological equipotentiality, right? So the idea that cortex is cortex and all kinds of cortex is interchangeable, and the assumption that Darwinian convergence applies to the phylogeny of psychology as well as to morphology, and the conceptual possibility, at least it was back then, that psychological predicates could apply to artificial intelligence agents as the three lines of evidence for functionalism. And all three of those show up as like important planks in your paper. So I guess I'm wondering, like, is this, do you want to say like, no, I'm not a functionalist, I'm a mechanist? Or do you want to say, yeah, I'm okay if this makes me substantially more or even much more functionalist than the mechanistic approaches so far? Where do you see your view fitting in on this hierarchy of explanation?
So I think I don't see functionalist views as being opposed to mechanist views. And maybe, okay, well, I might have idiosyncratic views here, but I basically think that I'm an identity theorist, but I'm an identity theorist because I'm a functionalist. And the idea is that, function imposes constraint on substrate, right? If you have a lot of constraints, then maybe there's only one substrate. Maybe there's only one arrangement of the substrate that can do the job, right? And I think that insofar as function does constrain substrate that tightly, we should be identity theorists empirically, even if not metaphysically. And in the context of explanation in science, there is just like the empirical question. And I think in this case, what the abstracted version of 3M tells us, and the success of these models tells us, is that the physical organization that we've thrown out in doing the similarity transform is not a functionally relevant fact about the organization of visual cortex for the purposes of explaining this task, right? And again, I think I would want to appeal to the fact that you need to do the same kind of mapping if you're trying to match monkey neurons to monkey neurons. So, every monkey has a different arrangement of neurons in V1. It seems like it doesn't matter exactly how you map them, but as long as you are able to map them in some way, V1 will do what it needs to do in order for the rest of the system to do what it needs to do in order to produce successful behavior. I guess I want to say one more thing about Weisskopf's objection, which is, I think even in classical cases of mechanism, there are lots of facts about physical location that are thrown away, right? And the pieces of your mechanism often aren't local, right? They're not in the same place. If you think about the mechanistic model of synaptic transmission, one of the components of it is something like ion concentrations inside and outside. That's like this diffuse thing where we're saying we don't care where all the particular ions are physically, right? All we care about is like this functional fact that there's a particular capacitance and a particular voltage across the membrane. That's what's relevant for our model, right? It's not the particular location of the particular molecules. And I think something similar is going on here. We're saying we want to be mechanists at the relevant level of abstraction. And it turns out that the relevant level of abstraction is maybe a little bit higher than the one that makes you specify where each cell sits geographically within a brain area.
How am I doing on time? One more question. Okay. So I think maybe, thank you for that answer. Sorry, Rosa. So one of the other things that I guess it was more in the paper, didn't maybe come up so much in the talk. Maybe you were it was one of the things you skipped over at the end. But it's something that I'm really curious about. So I'll ask anyway. So one of the things that you kind of back off on in the paper is the idea that the way the neural networks are trained corresponds very much to the ontogeny of learning in individual organisms. And you say more like, well, you know, one of the reasons we should think that there's a high degree of similarity in the internal functioning between the neural networks on the one hand and the brains on the other is because evolution is this kind of normative task inducer that causes both of these systems to converge in a certain type of organization at the end, right? And you end up emphasizing evolution a little bit more. And this is one of the positions that the Bayesian modelers have tried to push the deep learning proponents into. For example, in like the Lake Tenenbaum and Ullman BBS paper, one of the kind of bones they throw out to the deep mind type groups is to say like, well, you know, maybe there's something going on, but really when you train up, you know, AlphaGo or one of these vision systems, you're kind of like reprising the entire course of evolution by training it up from blank slate on millions and millions of images or 30 million games or whatever. Whereas what cognitive science should really be interested in, right, is like, how does the individual organism learn? Like, how is that learning scaffolded and guided by all kinds of innate biases and maybe knowledge structures and so on? And I wondered, how did you want your view about the explanatory relevance of the deep convolutional neural networks to fit into this kind of battle that's going on right now for the soul of cognitive science, where I see like, you know, the two main contenders right now are the sort of deep mind types over here who want to say like, this works way too well for it to be anything other than very close to true. And then the Bayesian modelers over here saying, no, you're just throwing, you know, hundreds of millions of data points at a network and reprising the whole course of evolution to reach the same endpoint. But it's really not learning anything like the way that biological organisms.
Okay, I mean, I think these are two different questions and we can ask them both, right? We can ask all the questions that we want. I think it's a different question, you know, how did it get this way evolutionarily? And, you know, how did it learn over the course of a lifetime? That's like one kind of question. And the different kind of question is the question that a mechanistic modeler is answering, right? Which is, what is the relationship between these sort of course level physical facts about the system and what it manages to do, right? I think that the mechanist is after a synchronic kind of explanation. And we should and can ask both questions. I think, and I think this is fairly clear when you think about the Bayesian modelers, like they're not mechanists, right? There is like no mechanistic validation of that stuff. So I don't think they are holding themselves to the same kinds of standards.
Okay, maybe I should turn it over to Catherine.
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
Thanks.
please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Cameron. And Matteo, can you jump in?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for your talk. I'm going to start with a verificatory question about the predictive adequacy of the models you are considering. Specifically, I'm curious about the contrast class, that is, what gets compared in evaluating the predictive adequacy of this class of deep neural networks. Specifically, I'm interested in whether trained versus untrained models are compared, and whether you have cases where the model is good at predicting variation in neural responses, but bad at the classification task.
Yeah, there's a picture. I don't don't know if it's worth trying to, okay, I won't try to show it, but right. So it seems like at least up to a certain degree of performance, being better at classification means that you're also better at predicting neural activity. I think for the comparison class, one obvious comparison class is how well can we predict neural activity using traditional neuroscientific methods, right, of recording and figuring out what the responses are of this group of cells to stimuli that we show it, and then try to predict their responses to novel stimuli. And the neural network models do a better job than models that are just based on brain data. Now, maybe I think that's probably just because we don't have enough brain data because recording is hard.
Yeah, that was my follow-up question, actually. I was curious about whether any model where feedback connections have a functional significance are compared to these feed-forward models. Specifically, what I have in mind is something like predictive coding models. Whether you have any study trying to compare say these two types of architectures, one feed-forward architecture versus an architecture where feedback and also recurrent, say, loops have functional significance.
Okay, so I should say I do not myself build any of these models, but I know that lots of groups have looked into this, and we know that there's lots of recurrent architecture in actual brains, and it seems like recurrent activity is like, you could imagine that it would be important for things like hanging on to information over time, or like integrating your priors into incoming information. I think what has been shown so far is a little bit surprising, that adding recurrence doesn't necessarily increase performance in object categorization at this task, although it helps. It might help at other tasks, and like maybe if we just haven't looked at the right kinds of things yet, or we haven't built the right sorts of models. I don't think we have like a principled thing to say that covers all the cases yet for recurrence.
Okay, nice. So my more substantial question is related to the second question Cameron asked. So I'm curious about what does the 3M++ rule out? In the paper, you consider three cases, one of which is a perceptron model of a biophysically detailed neuron. Kaplan and Craver consider other cases, dynamical models, or also, let's say, Hodgkin-Huxley models, and they want to say that they don't satisfy their 3M models, 3M constraint, and therefore those models are not explanatory. So I want to better understand what your proposal rules out, and whether there is any disagreement with the, say, Craver and Kaplan's 3M constraint.
Yeah, I think there is some disagreement. That's why we modified the constraint. But I think I would agree with them that some dynamical models are not mechanistic. We give a couple of examples in the paper of things that we don't think satisfy 3M++. So one of these is like just neural network predictors of something like genetic outcomes, right? We don't think that those neural networks are mirroring anything like the protein synthesis and production of traits over the course of development that actually genes engage in, genes in the developmental environment result in. We don't think that there's a model to mechanism mapping of any illuminating kind to be found there. We also think that the neural network model of a single neuron is not a good example of a model that satisfies any kind of mechanistic constraint, because it seems like the parts don't map to the parts. Rather, it's just like a statistical technique for matching the data or the fake data that's produced in your simulation of your neuron. I think we probably disagree with Kaplan and Craver about the Hodgkin-Huxley model. I think I'm more sympathetic to something like Arnaud Levy's view there, that that they are mechanists to some extent. You haven't filled in all of the details, but it seems like you have variables that correspond to particular physical types of things in the world, like ion channels, and like features of ion channels, and that makes them, mechanistic enough to be explanatory.
Thanks. I'm going to ask just another question and then pass it over to Catherine for the sake of time. So my last question for the moment, at least, has to do with the instrumentalist kind of take about neural networks you try to challenge. How would you react to counter objection along the following lines? These models you've been considering are so good at prediction because the bad ones have been selected away. So selected a sort of a selectionist take, which would be, in the spirit of Van Prassen's empirical constructive empiricism. And so you wouldn't actually need to say that these models track real structure, but just to say that the bad models have been selected out, and that's the explanation why these models work so well at prediction at the moment.
Well, it depends on what the selection was for, right? So if we trained up a bunch of models and they were all really good at image classification, and then we tried to use each of them to model the brain, and we threw away all the ones that didn't do a good job of modeling the brain, then I would agree, like maybe we haven't learned very much. On the other hand, like I don't think that's Van Frassen's thought about the selectionist story. I take it that he thinks that that's a good explanation of why models work because they've been selected to work.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess I think that that's true, but it's not really the question that we were trying to ask, right? We don't just want a historical explanation of why they work. We want some explanation of why they work that connects to other things that we know and believe about how the world works, like what summing up synaptic inputs and then thresholding does for you, right? What going through successive stages of processing does for you, what convolution does for you, right? We want to connect up the particular activities with the particular outcomes, and a purely selectional explanation doesn't give you that. And so I think if we just had the procedure where we throw out the models that aren't predictive of the brain on the basis of their not being predictive of the brain, then we would be doing something like curve fitting directly to brain data rather than having this sort of surprising result. This is the thing that I skipped over actually, where you're trying to fit one thing and you end up sort of accidentally, fortuitously, serendipitously also explaining this other thing that you didn't set out to match directly.
Thanks.
Okay. So thanks, Matteo, for your questions and Rosa for your answers. I think we can switch to Catherine. Please turn, activate your camera.
Right. Yeah, so I think my questions are going to end up being kind of versions of ones that you've already heard, but there'll be something new in them. So I find this that the predictive neural response is like a really cool result, and I don't want to downplay that, but want to also play devil's advocate a little bit with how big a coincidence is. That's how surprised and impressed should we be, and a couple more reasons for doubting that haven't been brought up yet are like one is about the ImageNet task itself and where the pictures come from, and that it was made by scraping the internet for images that had text associated with them, and then that was sort of through WordNet turned into this kind of like labels from this dictionary. And there's been some criticism of that as a data set. There are a bunch of biases built into it. So insofar as there's bias and sort of weirdness built into the data set, those are maybe ways that you could latch onto something that isn't really the right task. And so be doing well for, at least in part, for the wrong reasons. And another kind of related issue, and I think you acknowledged this, I got disconnected for a minute, and I think you were saying this while I was just sort of coming back online, is that putting word labels on images from the internet is like kind of a very dystopian take on like what the function of the visual system is. Yeah, and then kind of related to that, taking the inputs as an image, as pixels, and even if we're talking about retinal ganglion cell, like an image in that sense rather than in a digital image sense, that we're still assuming a lot about what the input is in this task. So like just photographic technology already has baked into it a lot of assumptions about what is important to primate brains. So that's another way where it's being helped out a little bit by the way that the task is set up. And just the assumption that something like an image is the input rather than the retinotopic map and in retinal ganglion cells being a part of the system that we're trying to explain. So you could shift that into sort of part of the system rather than being in the input. You know what I mean? So that's all the sort of playing devil's advocate about the task kind of stuff. I'll pause there for asking another question.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree it's not the task, but I think it's a task that we can do. So if you imagine like our full set of visual capacity is this like big bubble, then you might think like this is one sliver of our visual capacity, right? And maybe just explaining that sliver of our visual capacity is worth something. And I do think that, but I want to say more than that, which is that maybe you can't generate that sliver of competence unless you can also generate a bunch of other competences, right? So if that sliver overlaps with a bunch of things that we want to explain and has a common cause, then explaining that sliver might also help us explain more of the visual system. And I think there's a little bit of evidence for this, which is that, you know, you train it on ImageNet, and it's capable of doing other things like figuring out where objects are, right? Not just naming them and deciding that, you know, 3 things in different poses are pictures of the same object. I think that's some evidence that like you get other capacities because you need them in order to do this thing.
But on the other hand, like deep learning was designed to do well on the ImageNet task and other like related.
Yeah, it's optimized for that. Yeah.
That AI people care about. So like in it, yeah. So it's not that.
I think. Sorry, I think the other thing I want to say is that same Friedman point, which I'm sure was also made by philosophers, but I just read him most recently, which is that, you know, how unrealistic your assumptions are. You can't assess that without looking at how good the predictions are. And if the predictions are good, that's kind of validation of the assumptions that went in. So like if Galileo assumes that the difference in the, you know, air resistance of a big ball and a small ball is not that significant, there's no way for us to say ahead of time whether that's a good assumption or not. We just have to look at the results. And that it's as if your assumptions are also hypotheses, and then all the hypotheses together are sort of facing the tribunal as a corporate body, and like either they all come out well or they don't.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm on side, just playing devil's advocate mostly. Yeah. And the other thing that I think is kind of similar to Cameron's second question is I'm curious why you are deciding to take sort of 3M as something that you're hanging on to and then weakening, or rather than discarding it, basically, because you could read it another way. So the weakening of 3M that you're making are essentially that you don't really have to map onto the same physical intermediaries, that was too strong a requirement in the first place. And you don't need to do that in order to get insight into the causal structure. Getting insight into the causal structure is actually the thing that you're after. And those things can maybe come apart. And I mean, I've argued this elsewhere. And I mean, the example that motivated me to argue that elsewhere was exactly like neural networks and the way that I thought that they worked by at an abstract level coming up with something that's sort of abstractly similar in some way, and not by getting the physical intermediaries necessarily right. So I sort of read your paper as you struggling against the 3M requirements and them being too stringent, and so yeah, so just wondering like why are you sticking with 3M? We could just.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons. So one is I think it's an accurate description of scientific practice. So I think if you like characterize some neurobiological or neurophysiological phenomenon, thing that you want is a mechanism for it, right? Like what generated this effect that I'm observing? I think that's something that that scientists, in fact, are looking for in this domain. So that's one reason to like it. I think like 3M is some reasonable first order approximation to what scientists are doing in this area. So that's one reason to hang on to it. I think another reason to hang on to it is that there are mechanists everywhere. Maybe that's not the best reason. And then I think the real reason to hang on to it is because it's important. And I think there are a couple of reasons that it's important. Like one is I think there's a sense in which it's a gold standard, right? So if you just have phenomenology, if you just have something like social psychological results and you have no possible mechanism for something, you just have statistics that show that it happens over and over again, I think that's somehow less informative or less robust a theory than one where you can point to a mechanism and say, look, like based on the things that we know about physics and chemistry and biochemistry and like, you know, biological interactions, we can see how the effect is produced. I think that's really valuable, and that's not something that we want to get rid of. Because that's a kind of explanatory model where if you filled in more, as you fill in more and more details, like more and more interventions become possible, like more, it generates more hypotheses. I think it's fruitful, like all those other scientific goodness boxes get checked.
I mean, I think I agree with 3M being a good sort of distillation of something that a lot of scientists believe, and maybe the thing that's too strong about it is precisely the thing that people disagree about in terms of neural networks and whether there are good explanations or not. And that's so the ways that you disagree with it or the way that I disagree with it are the things that are at stake in that kind of question of like, are these things good explanations or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also pluralist about explanation. Like, I don't think mechanistic explanation is the only kind of explanation that's worth having. And like you know, different models have different goals, and you want all of them, right? Depending on what you're trying to achieve. And I think the part of like thinking that abstraction is positive and that you don't want just like more details all the time, I think is something that other people have pointed out about 3M as, you know, something that we can qualify without throwing the whole mechanistic framework away. But I think we do add like a substantial additional requirement that actually makes it stronger, not weaker, which is that the models have to be runnable, right? Like a mechanistic model of the synapse is not something that you can simulate and run. And I think having this requirement that you are able to simulate and run it is a kind of validation on your mechanistic model that it has enough of the parts, that it's not leaving anything crucial out.
Yeah,
so I guess if you want to say like this is now so different from 3M that it's not really 3M anymore, then I think it's just a verbal disagreement.
Yeah, I mean it could be a verbal disagreement, but if we want to maintain mechanistic explanation for whether for verbal reasons or other reasons, but bring more abstraction into it, like that's sort of the hill that I've decided to die on. I might be alone on that hill. Yeah, I mean my suspicion is that underlying like the reasons why 3M has what I think is too strict a requirement is sort of a more metaphysical view on like whether higher level causation is like an admissible thing or not. That would be maybe another reason for like a more than linguistic reason for disagreeing.
I mean, I think the mechanists are committed to higher level causation, right? Because like none of the classical mechanistic explanations are given in terms of fundamental particles or fundamental laws of physics. Like if you think that it's okay for mechanisms to bottom out at not the fundamental level, then you should be okay with them bottoming out at a more abstract level. I think that.
If you push Craver far enough, he'll go in that direction though. So
yeah. I'm not going all the way with Craver on that.
I'm not saying that. That's all I've got.
Okay, I guess we have still time for some questions from the attendees. Someone is willing to make a question, please use the raise hand button. It is shaped like one hand. Thanks, Catherine. Questions can also come from discussants. If you want second round,
In the meantime, there's Cameron with a question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Catherine and I in email, we were debating who gets to ask about adversarial examples, and it turned out neither of us did. So adversarial examples, what do you have to say about, you know, do they sink your battleship, or if not, why not?
I guess I'm not that worried about adversarial examples because it seems like, you know, there are lots of things that are like adversarial examples for human visual systems, right? There are things that we are unable to distinguish between that are actually quite different in the world. There are illusions, there are things that people disagree about, like the dress, where it seems like there's some really small difference that somehow makes a big difference in our behavioral output on Facebook, for example. And maybe that's just a feature of these kinds of systems, that they are susceptible to examples of this kind. And I think we shouldn't be surprised that the adversarial examples that artificial models are vulnerable to are different in some sense from the ones that we're vulnerable to, because as you guys have pointed out, they're very different training sets. And they're performing not exactly the same task. So I don't think we should be surprised that they're different. I think you want to say something like, to the extent that they're different for this reason. And that's exactly what we should expect, given the mode of explanation that we're following here.
Yeah, good. I mean, so it's an empirical question, right? But I think a lot of people suggested, you know, maybe if they were learning from videos and they could interact with the objects, you wouldn't see the same kinds of failure profile. But at the same time, you know, in the sense where you say, like, well, we trained them on this one task, labeling these images, and then this other thing, this amazing thing popped out, right? That we could predict the neural profiles in different levels of the cortex. Isn't that a huge bit of evidence? That's similar to the kind of argument that the old PDP connectionists used to make, and Catherine talks about this in some of her papers about, you know, well, the error profiles are often the same, like in the verb conjugating neural networks. It makes some of the same overgeneralization errors, right, that human children do when they're learning how to conjugate verbs. And so having the same error profiles always used to be one of these big planks of the PDP connectionist sources of evidence. And so it at least looks like, you know, it's a prima facie bad thing that they don't fail in the same ways, even on these weird stimuli. And
yeah, it definitely is a bad thing in the sense that you do want them to behave the same in as many contexts as possible. But I think the claim is not that they explain everything, right? The claim is that they explain the amount of variance in neural data that they in fact explain. And we should expect there to be differences. And the differences are plausibly attributable to differences in how they're trained in the architecture and like all these other actually functionally relevant differences. And if those differences are the phenomena that you're trying to explain, right, then you should absolutely go and investigate what changing the training regimen would do to get the failure profiles closer together, for example. But also, I guess I don't think there's a single thing like the failure profile, right? Like systems are going to be different in lots of ways in different contexts. And like, I think once you fix your target of explanation, then you can say, you know, how much of the variance is explained, given that this is the task that I care about. If the task is like mimicking the failure profiles, that's going to give you a different result than if the task is, you know, just mimicking the successful cases. Yeah, so I guess like I think the old PD people should have qualified their argument more, because there isn't a single failure profile to match.
Thanks, Cameron. We have a question from Mahi Ardalupas. I'm not sure I pronounced correctly. Apologies. You can speak.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks so much for the talk, Rosa. I just wanted to ask a question about optimization. So it seemed like when you were talking about optimization, there was this assumption that optimization is going to put constraints just by itself on the sorts of mechanisms that you'd get that would be able to like realize a particular function. And I'm just wondering what you think justifies that claim. Like, is that an empirical claim whereby we would have to see if that does actually turn out to be the case? Because it seems like it is possible that you could think that there's an optimization process, but that would still be multiple possible solutions to a particular one. So do you think, yeah, it's like an a priori thing that optimization is going to constrain, or is it, yeah, so like if it's empirical, what kind of things would you expect to sort of justify or test this?
Yeah, I don't think it's a priori. So in the paper, I appeal to this old landscape metaphor, right? So the thought is something like the task, the goal that you're interested in explaining successful performance on, that's something that induces a kind of landscape that's akin to the evolutionary landscape that's induced by whatever things an animal has to successfully do, for example, in order to achieve high fitness. And the thought is that the task completely determines the shape of that landscape. And if it turns out that that landscape only has one peak, then this way is going to lead us to, then optimization is going to lead us to a solution that's going to be similar to the one that biology found. If it turns out the landscape has many peaks, then we shouldn't expect that. I think it turned out in this case, this sort of serendipitous matching of neural activity by the artificial units, that's sort of first pass evidence that the landscape does have only a few peaks that are accessible from where we started in the biology and in the neural network design. But I think in general, like you can't say anything. You have to look at the actual task and see how many ways there are to solve that task. And I think that's a hard thing to assess empirically, except by trying a bunch of things. And I think it's going to be really difficult to prove that like you've tried everything or that there isn't some other way to do it that we just haven't seen yet. So I think it's very much empirical. I guess I'll say one more thing, which is that if the landscape actually is quite flat or rugged in such a way that like there isn't a clear single solution or set of similar solutions, then you're not going to get as good an explanation by doing this, by going through this optimization process. On the other hand, I think it also means that there is less of an explanation available in the sense that having a flattish landscape shows that there isn't any particular reason that the system came out that way. It was just an accident. It was path dependent. It could have been any number of other ways. So we can give less of an explanation, but I think there's also a little bit less there to explain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A more philosophically acceptable notion from these basic elements by, I don't know, tacking on, culture or something like that.
Right. Cool. Yeah, thanks. These are great questions. So I guess I wouldn't buy that this requires neurons. Like I think that, the stuff I showed you from Chris Ola's work of the doggy looking faces in a artificial neural network, I think those count as representations in the context of the particular problem that system is solving, which is the object recognition problem, right? And the fact that it can do so well, says that it must have learned the statistical structure of the particular, millions of images that it has been trained on, along with having, as I mentioned, having the architecture of the system, embodying constraints like the convolutional architecture and the hierarchical nature that, that reflect the constraints of the natural world, right? So I think that, ultimately, I think that, that these are all sort of results of statistical learning of various sorts. So it's associationism I agree that it's associationism in a way, though it's not the kind. I think when people think of associationism, they often think of basically what I was referring to as model-based or model-free learning, right? Which is basically, I'm going to go out in the world with no preconceptions about how the world works, and I'm going to start recording associations. That's clearly not how we work, and that recursive dimensionality argument shows that that kind of associationism just won't work. That you have to come at the world with constraints, with inductive biases, and we have different types of learning we can apply. We have sometimes we just learn statistical structure from the bottom up through unsupervised learning. Sometimes we learn through feedback. Sometimes we learn through teaching. We learn through sort of sort of prediction, kind of self-supervision, right? We predict what's going to happen, and then we see if it happens, and we change our predictions based on that. So I guess, I would be comfortable with calling this a sort of a sophisticated neo-associationism where constraints on the system are built in both by evolution and by by the nature of our learning mechanisms. And in terms of how I would differentiate between humans and other creatures, either natural or artificial, I think you're exactly right that it's a combination of what are the environments we live in, what are the things we need to do in those environments, what are the types of behaviors we exhibit, and then what are the neural mechanisms that we have that allow us to do those things with varying levels, right? Language is obviously something that humans have that others don't have, that allows us to solve problems in the environment that other organisms can't solve. And obviously evolution selected for that for a reason. So I think that's the right way to think about what those differences are.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Russ. Sorry, I'm moving to the next questions because there are quite a few. So we'll try to have as many people speaking as possible. We'd like to collect 3 questions at once. Lara Catherine, Wojciech Mamak, and Rodrigo Diaz, please, I'm muting you, Lara. Just very quick questions.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll make it quick, and I hope this is not repetitive because the previous question touched on some similar issues, but I have 2. Great paper, thank you. So I guess my question is, when does the representation start, or what qualifies as a representation, insofar as do the representations exist at every level, like at the level of the neuron or higher up the processing stream? So would edge detectors be considered a representation, or can the content at each stage or level be considered a representation? Because philosophers I'm a PhD student in neuroscience with a BA in philosophy. So philosophers might say that there is something sort of fundamentally different about representations, and that they must represent something as something else. And if they are not doing some explanatory work in that way, it's not a representation. So would you consider that representations are sort of doing work at every level, or there is some point in the brain where the information becomes a representation? That's my first.
That's a good question. So I guess I would, I'm willing to leave receptors out, right? The first layer of receptors in the retina maybe aren't representing the world, but once you get beyond that and you start having neural networks that apply evolved dimensionality reduction to their inputs, I'm comfortable calling those representations.
Okay. The one other quick question is that you said that representations must exist for an organism to behave intelligently in the world. So, but can't you have have intelligence without representation? So you might think that behavior could be explained by cognition, but perhaps not, right? So Rodney Brooks robots might be an example of where you have flexible behavior without representation via
I don't buy that.
associative learning.
No, I don't buy that his systems don't have representation.
Right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Wojciech Mamak.
Yeah. Hello. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Right. Thanks for the talk once again. I have 2 quick questions. One, I'm wondering, what you said about cognitive ontologies. I'm wondering whether what you said can illuminate how we can differentiate the cognitive processes. What I'm mostly interested in is, do you have an opinion on what you said gives an indication or the inferential account of cognition or perception, would you be sympathetic to that kind of account? So would you say that there's
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by an inferential account.
So the idea basically that you can differentiate inference from association, for instance, in a cognitive system, based on the account.
I mean, I don't buy that those are. I mean, I think that these are all functions of a statistical learning apparatus. That these things infer, they build representations, they use those representations to infer. And I think that a lot of the work in probabilistic analysis of neural systems is showing this to be a really useful lens, at least on how brains work. So I don't buy the need to kind of separate those.
Okay, right. Thank you.
Maybe we got time just for a last question, Marco, right? And then...
Yeah, but we have a plan for the unasked questions. So Rodrigo, be the last one.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so this is related to what Adina Roskis was saying before, questioning whether these are representations or not, or whether representations in the interesting sense. And I wonder whether we could grant that these patterns of neural activity are representations, at least non-conceptual representations, maybe, as long as they, like properties of the stimuli, predict these patterns of neural activity. So it seemed like this pattern of neural activity, or at least they are representing these low-level properties. But maybe even they are actually conceptual representations as long as they are associated with a specific label. So they are specific with cat, or so they will be not only representing the low-level properties, but representing this as a cat. So they will be conceptual. And then, so this could be actually representations and maybe conceptual representations. And then the interesting question is whether these can be combined or used in other processes. So then the claim that will be questionable is not whether these are representations, or these are real representations, but whether these are the basis of intelligent behavior, as I think it was said in some part of this.
So yeah, thank you. So I guess the challenge for me is, where do you draw the line, right? You might imagine that a visual edge in a particular place in space, that's a conceptual description, right? There's lots of patterns of visual input that could give rise to the same apparent visual line in space, but that's going to allow higher order behavior to happen. But I don't think that's what people are thinking of, right? They're thinking of like cats or love or some sort of like very high level conceptual thing. But I don't see a fundamental line between like an edge in a place in terms of like the conceptualization of representation that I'm thinking of. I don't see a fundamental line between like an edge in a particular place in space and something that looks like a cat.